Somewhere beneath your feet right now, there are tunnels. Not the ones built for trains or cars or cables. Not the ones engineers designed with blueprints and machines. These tunnels are older, much older. Some of them are so old that no one alive today knows who made them, or why, or how. They stretch for miles in some places. In others, they go so deep into the earth that even modern tools have trouble measuring where they end. And here is the quiet part that makes this truly strange. These tunnels exist on nearly every continent on Earth. They show up in Europe, in South America, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa. Different cultures, different time periods, different materials, and yet the same basic idea, a tunnel underground hidden from the world above. This is not a coincidence that historians find easy to explain. And the more you sit with that thought, the more curious it becomes. So tonight, let us go underground together, slowly, quietly. There is no rush. We are going to walk through some of the most mysterious passages that have ever been discovered beneath the surface of this earth. And along the way, we are going to ask the quiet question that keeps coming back, no matter how many facts we gather. Who built these tunnels? And why does it feel like someone long ago understood something that we have only recently begun to remember? Let us begin gently. Let us begin at the beginning. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Whether you are lying down to rest, sitting quietly in a room, or simply looking for something calm and fascinating to carry you through the hours ahead, this is a good place to be. We are going to spend a long time together tonight, moving slowly through one of history's most quietly astonishing mysteries. The ancient underground tunnels of the world. Who made them? What they were used for? Why they were forgotten? And what it might mean that they exist on almost every part of this planet. There is no need to rush. Every idea will come to you gently in its own time. And by the end, you will not feel like you have been given a list of facts. You will feel like you have traveled somewhere, because in a way you will have. So take a slow breath, let your body settle, and let us go very gently underground. Imagine you are a farmer in a small village in Central Europe. The year is sometime in the early 20th century. The land around you has been farmed by your family for generations. You know every hill, every stone wall, every field. You think you know the earth beneath your feet too. But one morning, while digging in a place you have dug many times before, your shovel strikes something hollow. You press a little harder, the earth shifts, and suddenly there is a hole where there was not a hole before. You crouch down and look inside. It is dark. The air coming up from below is cool and still, the way old air feels. You light a small lamp and lower it into the opening. And what you see stops your breath for a moment. A passage, cut directly into the rock and clay. Smooth walls, a low ceiling, going somewhere. Going somewhere you cannot see from where you are standing. This is roughly how many of Europe's most mysterious underground tunnels have been found. Not by archaeologists on an official dig. Not by a team of scientists with equipment. Just by ordinary people doing ordinary things who happen to press a shovel into the wrong, or perhaps the right, piece of earth. The tunnels that were uncovered across Central Europe, particularly in what is now Germany, Austria, and parts of Slovakia and Hungary, became known by a German name, Erdstall. It is a simple word. It roughly means something like an earth stall or an underground cavity, but simple names can hide extraordinary things. The Erdstall tunnels of Europe are genuinely puzzling. They are narrow, very narrow. In many places, only a single person can move through them, and only by crouching or sometimes by lying almost flat and pulling themselves forward. They twist and turn in ways that do not follow any obvious logic. They double back on themselves. They split into two passages and then rejoin. They sometimes end abruptly in a small chamber with no exit. And they are very, very old. Most researchers believe they were built somewhere between the 10th and 13th centuries, though some may be older still. Here is what makes them strange beyond just their age. There are thousands of them, not a handful, not a few dozen scattered across a region. Thousands. More than 700 have been found in Bavaria alone. Others have been found in Austria, in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, in Spain. They seem to appear wherever medieval Europeans lived. And yet, for a very long time, no one in the historical record mentioned them. No medieval document describes them. No church record refers to them. No map marks them. It is as though an enormous number of people quietly dug these tunnels into the earth, and then the knowledge of why they did it simply vanished. Archaeologists who have spent their careers studying the Erdstall tunnels will tell you something interesting when you ask them what these tunnels were used for. They will pause. They will choose their words carefully. And then, most honestly, they will say something like this: "We are not entirely sure." Think about what that means for a moment. These are trained scientists. They have the tunnels right in front of them. They can measure them, date the sediment inside them, analyze the tool marks on the walls. And still, the purpose of these structures resists easy explanation. Some theories exist, of course. Some researchers have suggested the tunnels were hiding places, places where people could retreat during times of war or raid. And that makes a kind of sense. Medieval Europe was not a peaceful place. Vikings raided coastal and river communities. Armies moved through the land. Bandits were a real and constant danger. If you could disappear underground quickly, that might save your life. But there are problems with this theory. The tunnels are often too small and too long to be practical hiding places. They are not connected to houses or churches in ways that would make a quick escape easy. Some of them are so narrow that getting into them quickly in a moment of danger would be almost impossible. And many of them have no obvious entrance from above ground at all. You would have to already know where you were going to use them. Others have suggested the tunnels were used for storing food. The temperature underground is cool and steady, and before the age of refrigeration, keeping things cold was genuinely important. But again, the shapes and layouts of these tunnels do not really match what you would expect from simple storage cellars. They are too winding, too difficult to access, and often too far from any structure above ground. A third theory, and perhaps the most quietly haunting one, is that these tunnels had a spiritual purpose, that they were connected to beliefs about the underworld, about passage between worlds, about the movement of souls or spirits through the earth. This idea is harder to prove with physical evidence, but it is also harder to dismiss. Because when you look at the tunnels carefully, at the way they twist and double back, at the small chambers that seem to lead nowhere, at the sense that they were designed to be difficult to navigate rather than easy, something about them feels less like a practical structure and more like a symbolic one. As if the act of moving through them was the point, not the destination. We will come back to that idea later, because it turns out to be relevant in ways that reach far beyond Europe. But for now, let us sit with the image of the Erdstall tunnels for a moment longer. Thousands of hand-dug passages, carved through rock and earth over centuries, by people who left no written record of why they were doing it. People who crouched in narrow spaces underground by lamplight, moving stone and clay with tools that were simple by any standard, and creating something that would outlast every explanation they might have given. There is something quietly moving about that. Something that makes you feel the distance between their world and ours, and also, strangely, the closeness. Because they were people, just like us, living their lives, tending their fields, raising their children. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary life, they went underground, again and again, for reasons they understood completely, even if we no longer do. Now let us move a little deeper, because the Erdstall tunnels of Europe, as mysterious as they are not the deepest part of this story. They are, in a way, just the doorway, the place where we begin to feel the shape of something much larger. To understand the full picture, we need to travel. We need to move across time and across the surface of the earth. We need to visit places that seem, on the surface, to have nothing in common with a small farming village in Bavaria. And yet, underground, the same quiet question waits for us in all of them. Let us go, then. Slowly, gently. Let us follow the tunnels where they lead. Before we leave Europe entirely, it is worth spending a little more time here, because Europe has more than just the Erdstall tunnels. Europe has something older, something that makes even those medieval passages seem recent by comparison. In Turkey, which sits at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, there is a region called Cappadocia. If you have ever seen photographs of it, you will not have forgotten them. The landscape looks like something from another world. Tall, strange rock formations rise from the ground in clusters. The rock itself is a pale cream color, soft and light, shaped by millions of years of volcanic activity and erosion into forms that look almost carved. And in many ways they are carved, because the people who lived here, thousands of years ago, did not just build on top of this landscape. They built inside it, and beneath it. The underground cities of Cappadocia are among the most extraordinary things that human beings have ever made. And they are not small. The most famous of them, a city called Derinkuyu, goes at least 18 levels deep into the earth. 18 floors going down. When you stand at the surface and look at the dry, rocky ground beneath your feet, and then you learn that beneath you, carved entirely by hand out of the soft volcanic rock, is a city that could shelter tens of thousands of people, it is genuinely difficult to take in. Derinkuyu was not a temporary shelter. It was a city in every real sense of the word. It had living spaces. It had storage rooms for food and wine and oil. It had stables for animals. It had churches with altars and spaces for gathering. It had schools. It had ventilation shafts that ran all the way from the deepest levels up to the surface, keeping the air breathable even at the lowest depths. It had wells that reached down to underground water sources. And it had massive stone doors, circular like wheels, that could be rolled into place to block the tunnels from the inside, sealing the entire city against anyone trying to force their way in. Think about that engineering for a moment. Not the building of it, though that is remarkable enough, but the thinking behind it. Someone, long before any of the machinery we take for granted today, sat down and worked out how to build a city underground that could sustain life. They thought about air. They thought about water. They thought about food storage and the temperatures needed to keep things from spoiling. They thought about sanitation. They thought about light. They thought about how to move large groups of people through narrow spaces without chaos. They thought about defense, and they designed a door that could not be pushed open from the outside. This is not primitive thinking. This is sophisticated thinking. It is the thinking of people who understood engineering and materials and human needs and defensive strategy. All of it applied underground in the dark, in a city that the surface of the earth gives almost no hint of. Derinkuyu is the most famous, but it is not alone. There are hundreds of underground structures in Cappadocia. Some are small, just a few rooms. Others are substantial, and they are connected, at least in part, by tunnels. Long tunnels that run between the underground cities, so that in theory, you could move from one to another without ever coming to the surface. The tunnels between the Cappadocian cities are in some places miles long, and they were carved, as everything else here was carved, by hand, by people using tools made of iron and wood and stone, moving through rock, one strike at a time, for reasons they considered important enough to justify enormous effort. Who built these tunnels and cities? The Hittites are sometimes mentioned. They were a powerful civilization that existed in this region of Anatolia thousands of years ago, and they are known to have used some underground spaces. But many historians are not convinced that the Hittites built Derinkuyu in its full form. The scale of it seems to go beyond what is typically associated with Hittite construction. Others point to the Phrygians, another ancient people of this region. Others suggest that the structures were expanded and used by many different peoples over many centuries, each generation inheriting what came before and adding to it. The Christian communities who lived in Cappadocia during the early centuries of the Common Era certainly used these spaces. When Rome was persecuting Christians, this region became a refuge. The underground cities provided exactly the kind of concealment and safety that a persecuted community would need. And the presence of churches and religious carvings in the deepest levels suggests that faith was practiced here, quietly, far below the ground where no Roman soldier would easily find it. But even this does not fully explain the construction. The deepest and most structurally complex parts of Derinkuyu appear to be older than the Christian period, much older in some estimates, which means that whoever designed the original structure, whoever first looked at this volcanic rock and imagined an entire city inside it, remains a question without a complete answer. And here is a detail that tends to stay with people once they learn it. When archaeologists first began seriously studying Derinkuyu in the mid-20th century, they found that the ventilation system was not just functional, it was elegant. The shafts that brought air down from the surface were positioned and angled in such a way that they created natural airflow. Cool air moved down on one side and warm, stale air moved up on the other, driven not by any mechanical system, but by the simple physics of temperature and pressure that the builders had clearly understood and planned for. This is not accidental. You cannot accidentally create a ventilation system that works this way. You have to understand the principles involved. You have to plan for them, which means that the people who designed Derinkuyu understood something about the behavior of air, about fluid dynamics in a basic but real sense, that allowed them to build a city underground that people could breathe in for years at a time. That is not the work of people who were fumbling in the dark. That is the work of people who knew what they were doing. Now, as we sit with the image of those underground cities, with their rolling stone doors and their elegant ventilation and their deep, quiet chambers, let us ask the quiet question that runs beneath all of this. Why underground? Why, in so many different places and times, did people choose to go below the surface of the earth? What did the underground mean to them? Because here is something that becomes clear the more you look at this subject. The decision to build underground was never purely practical. It was almost never just about hiding from enemies, though that was sometimes part of it. There was something else, something that drew human beings downward, into the dark, into the earth, that goes deeper than any single explanation. We will explore that feeling as we go. For now, let us carry it with us. Let it travel with us as we leave Europe and move toward the east. Let us travel now. Let us leave the pale volcanic rock of Cappadocia and move eastward. Through the dry hills of the Middle East, through the ancient river valleys where some of the earliest human civilizations first took root, and into the places where the underground was not just a refuge or a mystery, but a way of life that entire societies were built around. We are going to a place that most people have heard of, but few people truly know. We are going to Persia, to the land that is now called Iran. And we are going to follow a system of underground engineering that is so vast, so intelligent, and so quietly beautiful that even today, thousands of years after it was first created, it still works. It is called the Qanat. The word itself is simple. It comes from an ancient Semitic root meaning channel or pipe. But the thing it describes is far from simple. A Qanat is an underground water channel, a tunnel dug by hand into the earth that carries water from a source deep in the mountains or hills down to a village or a city on the plain, sometimes over distances of many miles. And the Qanat system of ancient Persia is not one tunnel. It is not 10 or 100. There are more than 30,000 Qanats still identifiable in Iran today. Some of them are still in use, still carrying water, still doing the job they were designed to do, in some cases more than 2,000 years ago. Let us think about what that means. Not just as an engineering achievement, though it is certainly that, but as a statement about the people who built these tunnels and the world they lived in. The landscape of central Iran is, in many places, deeply hostile to human life. It is dry. The rainfall is sparse and unreliable. The summers are brutally hot, hot enough that water left on the surface of the earth simply evaporates before it can do much good. And yet, for thousands of years, large and sophisticated civilizations flourished in this landscape. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands, gardens that were so lush and beautiful that they became the origin of the very word paradise. The old Persian word paradisa meant a walled garden, and it was a concept so astonishing to the dry world around it that it became a word for heaven itself. How did they do it? How did people create paradise in a landscape that seemed to forbid it? They went underground. The basic principle of the Qanat is elegant in its simplicity. You find a place in the hills or mountains where water exists underground. You dig a vertical shaft down to the level of that water. Then you dig a gently sloping horizontal tunnel from that point, following the natural gradient of the land, toward the village or city where the water is needed. You dig more vertical shafts along the way, both to remove the excavated material and to let air in and out. And the water moves through your tunnel, slowly and steadily, driven by nothing but gravity, sheltered from the sun, cool and clean and constant, until it emerges at the surface in exactly the place where it is needed. That is the principle. But the execution is something else entirely. Because getting this right requires a precise understanding of the landscape. You need to know exactly where the water table is. You need to know the gradient of the land accurately enough to dig a tunnel that slopes at just the right angle, not so steep that the water rushes and erodes the tunnel walls, not so flat that the water stops moving altogether. You need to understand how water behaves underground, how it moves through different types of soil and rock, how it responds to seasonal changes, to rainfall patterns, to the weight of the earth above it. The people who designed the Qanats had all of this knowledge. They had it not from books or formal scientific education in the modern sense, but from generations of accumulated understanding, from fathers teaching sons, from master builders who had spent entire lifetimes underground, learning the language of the earth through their hands and their eyes and their slow, patient attention. These builders were called mukani, the tunnel diggers, and they were among the most respected craftsmen in Persian society. Their knowledge was specialized, deep, and not easily shared with outsiders. They understood things about the underground that most people on the surface never needed to know. They could read the color and texture of soil and know whether water was near. They could feel a slight dampness in the air inside a tunnel and know they were close to a water source. They carried simple tools, picks, baskets for removing earth, oil lamps for light, and with these tools they carved channels through the darkness that would outlast empires. Because that is perhaps the most astonishing thing about the Qanats. They did outlast empires. The Persian Empire rose and fell. Alexander the Great swept through. The Parthians came, and then the Sassanids, and then the Islamic caliphates, and then the Mongols. Each of these waves of change reshaped the politics and culture and religion of the land. But the Qanats kept working, because they were underground, because the surface events that disrupted so much of human life could not reach them. Because water, following gravity through a carefully dug tunnel, does not care who is king. There is something quietly profound about that. A system of tunnels that outlasted every political upheaval, every invasion, every change of dynasty, simply by being below the level at which those things happen. The Qanats are a kind of deep continuity, a thread of ancient engineering that runs through all of Persian history, holding it together from beneath. And when you walk along the surface of the land in parts of Iran today, you can see the evidence of the Qanats even without going underground. Every few meters, rising up from the flat earth, there are small mounds. They look almost like a line of ant hills, stretching across the landscape in a gentle curve. Each mound marks a vertical shaft, and the line of shafts tells you where the water is moving underground, from the hills toward the plain, following a path that someone decided upon and dug, perhaps 2,000 years ago. It looks from above like a dotted line drawn across the earth, as if someone were pointing, as if the land itself were trying to show you something. Now let us pause here for a moment, because the Qanat is an extraordinary thing on its own terms, but it also connects to something larger that we are slowly building toward. The Qanat represents a kind of relationship with the underground that is about sustaining life rather than hiding from danger. The people who built these tunnels were not fleeing from enemies. They were not seeking spiritual passage or symbolic meaning in the narrow dark. They were feeding their civilization. They understood that the surface of the earth, with all its heat and light and visibility, was not where the real sustenance was. The real sustenance was underground, hidden, cool, patient, flowing quietly through the dark toward the people who needed it. This is a different way of thinking about the underground than the one most of us carry in our minds. We tend to think of underground spaces as dark and dangerous, as places you go when you have no choice. But for the people of ancient Persia, the underground was generous. It was where the water was. It was where life came from. And the act of digging into the earth was not an act of desperation, but an act of understanding, of knowing where the real resources were and being patient and skilled enough to reach them. As we continue our journey, we will find this theme appearing again and again. The underground as a place of sustenance, of preservation, of something hidden but deeply alive, and the tunnels that reach into it, not as escapes from the world above, but as connections to something deeper and more enduring. But first, let us move further east, because there are tunnels waiting for us in the direction of the rising sun that will add another layer to this quiet mystery entirely. India is one of the oldest living civilizations on Earth. Its cities, its languages, its religious traditions stretch back thousands of years into a past that is still not fully understood. And beneath the surface of the Indian subcontinent, there are structures that belong to that deep past in ways that are still being uncovered. The step wells of India are perhaps the most visually stunning of these underground structures. They are not tunnels in the narrow sense. They are more like inverted temples, open structures cut down into the earth, with staircases and platforms and carved galleries descending level by level to the water table below. But they are underground. They are carved into the earth. And they share with the Qanats and the Erdstall tunnels and the cities of Cappadocia that same essential quality of going down, of choosing depth over height, of finding something important in the direction that most architecture ignores. The step wells, called Vav or Bayali in different regions of India, were built primarily in the western and central parts of the subcontinent, in places where the water table was deep and the rainfall was unpredictable. The oldest known examples are more than 4,000 years old, contemporary with the Indus Valley civilization, that mysterious and still only partially understood culture that built carefully planned cities with remarkable sewage systems and standardized weights and measures at a time when much of the rest of the world was still in very early stages of organized settlement. But the step wells reached their greatest artistic and engineering complexity during the period between roughly the 3rd and 16th centuries of the Common Era. During this time, the people of what is now the Indian state of Gujarat and the surrounding regions built step wells of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. The most famous of them, Rani Kai Vav in the town of Patna, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. And when you see images of it, the word that comes to mind is not engineering. The word that comes to mind is temple, because Rani Kai Vav is not just a hole in the ground with stairs going down to the water. It is a 7-story inverted temple, its walls and platforms and ceilings covered with more than 500 major sculptures and thousands of smaller carvings. Gods and goddesses, celestial figures, ordinary people, animals, geometric patterns, scenes from mythology, all of it carved into the stone walls of a structure that goes down into the earth. All of it for centuries invisible, because Rani Kai Vav was buried, silted over by floods sometime in the 11th or 12th century, and it lay underground, perfectly preserved beneath the earth for 800 years. When archaeologists began excavating it in the 20th century, they found it essentially intact. The carvings were as crisp as the day they were made. The stairways were still sound. The structure had survived 8 centuries of burial because the very thing that buried it, the silt from the flooding, had also protected it from the elements. The underground had preserved it. And here again we find that theme. The underground as a place of preservation, of things lasting longer, enduring better when they are beneath the surface rather than upon it. The earth, in a strange way, keeping things safe. But let us not only think about step wells as objects of beauty. Let us think about what they meant to the people who built them and to the people who used them. A step well in ancient India was not a purely utilitarian structure. It was a public space, a social space. In the heat of an Indian summer, when the temperature on the surface could be brutal and the sun unrelenting, descending into a step well was like entering a different world. The temperature dropped. The air became cool and moist. The noise of the surface world faded. And around you, on all sides, were carvings of gods and figures that connected you to something larger than daily life. You went down into the earth to get water, and while you were there, you were also in a kind of sacred space, a place where the practical and the spiritual were woven together in stone. This combination, the practical reason for going underground combined with the spiritual or symbolic meaning of the underground space itself, is something we see in culture after culture. And it suggests that for most of human history, the underground was understood as a space with a double nature. It was the place where water came from, where food could be stored, where safety could be found. But it was also something else, something that touched on the deeper questions that human beings have always carried. Where do we come from? Where do we go? What is beneath the surface of things? Now let us move still further east, because the Indian subcontinent is not the end of our journey in this direction. There are tunnels in Southeast Asia, in China, in Japan, that belong to this same long story. And some of them raise questions that are even harder to answer than the ones we have met so far. In China, the underground has been a place of power and mystery for as long as written history goes back, and probably longer. The tomb complexes of ancient Chinese emperors are among the most extraordinary underground constructions in the world. The most famous, the tomb of the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, is surrounded by the famous terracotta army, thousands of life-size clay soldiers arranged in battle formation in underground chambers near the city of Xi'an. But the burial mound itself, the place where the emperor's body is believed to rest, has never been fully excavated. It is still sealed. And the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about it more than 2,000 years ago, described it as a vast underground palace, with rivers of mercury flowing through it, a ceiling embedded with pearls to represent the stars, and mechanical crossbows set to fire automatically at anyone who tried to enter. Some of this sounds like legend. Some of it may be. But here is the strange part. When archaeologists tested the soil around the burial mound, they found elevated levels of mercury. Real mercury, in the ground, in roughly the patterns that the ancient descriptions suggested, which means that at least some of what Sima Qian wrote was not legend. There really were rivers of mercury in that underground palace, and the underground palace is still there, sealed and unexcavated, beneath a hill in central China, waiting. The decision not to excavate it is partly about respect for the dead and partly about technical caution. The mercury levels are genuinely dangerous. And there is a feeling among some of the archaeologists and historians involved that perhaps it is better to leave some things sealed, to let the underground keep its secrets. That instinct to leave the underground undisturbed is one we will return to, because it turns out to be very old and very widespread. But let us move now to a set of tunnels that are less famous than the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, but in some ways more mysterious. We are going to go to Japan. And we are going to look at something that sits at the edge of what mainstream archaeology is comfortable discussing. Japan is a country of extraordinary geological activity. It sits on the meeting point of several tectonic plates. Earthquakes are common. Volcanoes are active. The landscape itself is in a constant slow process of change. And beneath the surface of Japan, there are caves and lava tubes, natural tunnels formed by ancient volcanic activity that go very deep and stretch for very long distances. But alongside these natural formations, there are also structures, carved spaces in the rock that show the marks of tools, underground chambers of uncertain age and purpose. And in a few places, tunnels that connect sites in ways that seem deliberate, that seem planned but whose origins are unclear, and whose builders are not identified in any historical record. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered off the southern coast of Japan in the 1980s, is perhaps the most debated of all Japanese underwater mysteries. And it is underwater now, which adds another layer of strangeness to it. But there are land-based examples too. The Ishibutai Kafun in Nara Prefecture is a massive burial mound built from enormous stone blocks, with an underground chamber at its heart that required the movement of stones weighing up to 77 tons each. The engineering required to move and place these stones, using only the tools available in the 7th century, is something that no one has fully explained to everyone's satisfaction. And surrounding these burial mounds and stone chambers in certain regions of Japan, there are tunnel systems that seem to connect them, not always to each other, sometimes to water sources, sometimes to points on the landscape that correspond to astronomical alignments, sometimes, apparently, to nothing obvious at all. The Japanese relationship with the underground is deeply embedded in spiritual tradition. In Shinto, the indigenous religious tradition of Japan, certain spaces are considered sacred, not because of what has been built there, but because of the quality of the space itself. Mountains are sacred, springs are sacred, caves are sacred, and the underground in general is considered to be a place of connection with the world of spirits and ancestors. Not a fearful place, not a dangerous place, but a significant one. A place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors becomes thinner. This idea of the underground as a threshold, as a place where different worlds are closer to each other than they are on the surface, is one that we find in different forms in almost every culture that has left any record of what they believed. And it is worth sitting with that quietly for a moment, because it suggests something interesting about human psychology and human experience. People all over the world, without any obvious contact with each other, looked at the underground and felt the same thing, felt that it was significant, that it was not just a hole in the ground, that it was, in some way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel, connected to the deepest questions of existence. Why would that be? What is it about underground spaces that produces this feeling across such different cultures and times? Part of the answer may be purely physical. Underground spaces are quiet. The noise of the surface world, wind, birds, human activity disappears almost completely once you are a few meters below the surface. The temperature becomes steady, unchanging through seasons. The light without artificial sources is absolute darkness. And absolute darkness and absolute quiet are things that human beings rarely experience on the surface. They alter perception. They slow the mind. They create a kind of presence that is difficult to find in ordinary life. Anyone who has spent time in a deep cave without artificial light will tell you that the experience is unlike anything else. Not frightening in the way you might expect, more like a kind of softening, as if the usual noise of thought and sensation quiets down and something more fundamental becomes perceptible. Ancient people felt this, and they interpreted it through the frameworks they had, through the language of spirits and ancestors and the sacred. But the underlying experience, the quieting, the deepening, the sense of something beyond ordinary life, that was real. That was not just interpretation. That was something the underground actually produced in the people who went there. And perhaps that is part of why so many ancient tunnels and underground spaces were not purely practical. Perhaps the people who built them were not just solving practical problems. Perhaps they were also seeking something. Something that the surface world, with all its noise and movement and urgency, could not provide. Something that only the underground could offer. Let us now cross an ocean. Let us leave the ancient world of Europe and Asia and travel westward, across the wide Atlantic, to a continent that holds some of the most extraordinary underground mysteries in the entire story of human civilization. We are going to the Americas. And what we find here will deepen everything we have already explored and add dimensions to this quiet mystery that we have not yet imagined. The Americas are vast. They stretch from the frozen north to the frozen south, encompassing every kind of landscape and climate that exists on this planet. Deserts and rainforests, high mountain plateaus and low coastal plains, river deltas and volcanic islands. And beneath all of it, there are tunnels. There are underground spaces. There are passages cut into the earth by human hands, in places and at times that do not always fit neatly into the stories we tell about the ancient past of this continent. Let us begin in South America. Let us begin in Peru. Peru is a country that sits on the western edge of the South American continent, pressed between the Pacific Ocean on one side and the enormous spine of the Andes Mountains on the other. It is a landscape of dramatic contrasts. The coast is one of the driest deserts in the world. The mountains are among the highest on Earth, and in between and above and around all of it, there are the traces of civilizations that flourished here for thousands of years before European contact. The most famous of these civilizations is the Inca, but the Inca were the last of a long line. Before them came the Wari, the Tiwanaku, the Nazca, the Chavín, the Carol. Each of these cultures left marks on the landscape. Some left them above the surface. Some left them below it, and some left tunnels. The tunnels beneath the city of Cusco, which was the capital of the Inca Empire, are perhaps the most discussed underground structures in South America. Cusco sits in a high valley in the Andes, at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters above sea level. It is a city of extraordinary history, its Spanish colonial architecture built on top of, and in many cases directly incorporating the massive stone foundations of Inca buildings beneath. And beneath those Inca foundations, according to local tradition, legend, and a growing body of archaeological evidence, there is something older still. The tunnels of Cusco have been part of local oral tradition for as long as anyone can remember. Stories of underground passages connecting the great temples and palaces of the Inca city. Stories of passages stretching from Cusco to other sacred sites. Stories of passages going very deep, much deeper than any known Inca construction. And stories of things hidden in those passages. Treasures, yes, in some versions, but also something else. Knowledge, records, objects whose nature is not entirely clear in the telling. For a long time, these stories were treated by mainstream archaeology as legend, as the kind of thing that all ancient peoples say about their underground spaces, embellished, symbolic, not to be taken as literal description. But in recent decades, ground-penetrating radar surveys and limited excavations have begun to reveal that beneath Cusco, there really are cavities, really are passages, really are underground spaces that have not been fully explored. The most intriguing of these is connected to the Coricancha. The Coricancha was the greatest temple of the Inca Empire. It was dedicated to Inti, the sun god, and its walls were reportedly covered in sheets of gold. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they stripped the gold from the walls of the Coricancha and built a Christian church on top of its foundations. That church still stands today, the Iglesia de Santo Domingo, and if you look at its lower walls, you can see the perfectly fitted Inca stonework beneath the Spanish construction. But beneath the Coricancha itself, beneath the foundations of both the Inca temple and the Spanish church, there are reported to be tunnels. The Spanish chroniclers who wrote about Cusco in the years after the conquest mentioned them. Indigenous oral traditions preserve detailed descriptions of them, and limited technical surveys have suggested that the subsurface cavities are real. What is in them? No one knows with certainty. Full excavation has not been permitted for a combination of practical and political reasons. The church above is a functioning religious building. The Peruvian government has complex relationships with both the colonial heritage and the indigenous heritage of the site. And perhaps there is also, beneath the official explanations, something of that ancient instinct we mentioned earlier. The instinct to leave some underground places sealed, to let the earth keep certain things. But let us step back from the specific question of what might be in the tunnels of Cusco and think about the broader picture. Because the tunnels of the Inca and pre-Inca world are not confined to Cusco. They appear across the Andean region. They appear at Sacsayhuaman, the massive fortress complex above Cusco, where underground chambers and passages have been partially explored. They appear at Ollantaytambo, another great Inca site, where the relationship between the visible stone structures above ground and the spaces below them is not fully mapped. They appear at Tiwanaku, in what is now Bolivia, the remains of a culture that predates the Inca and whose understanding of stone and water and underground space was remarkable. And they appear, in a particularly haunting form, at the site of Chavín de Huantar. Chavín de Huantar is one of the oldest major ceremonial centers in the Andes. It was occupied and built upon for thousands of years, beginning perhaps as early as 3,000 years before the Common Era. It sits in a high mountain valley where two rivers meet, a location that in Andean cosmology had deep spiritual significance. Water flowing together, mountains rising on all sides, the earth and sky in close conversation, and within the massive stone structures of Chavín de Huantar, there are tunnels, a complex network of passages and chambers cut into the interior of the buildings themselves, moving through them in ways that are dark and narrow and deliberately disorienting. The tunnels of Chavín were not storage spaces or escape routes. They were something far more deliberate and far more strange. Archaeologists who have studied Chavín extensively believe that these interior tunnels were used for ritual initiation. That people, probably priests, probably individuals undergoing specific transformative experiences, were guided through these dark, narrow passages as part of a deliberate process of psychological transformation. The darkness, the disorientation, the strange acoustics of the stone tunnels, the complete removal from the ordinary sensory world of the surface, all of this was apparently intentional. All of it was designed to produce a specific kind of experience. And there is more. Analysis of plant material found at Chavín has suggested that psychoactive substances were used in rituals there. Substances derived from plants like the San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, and other compounds that alter perception. The combination of these substances with the sensory environment of the tunnels, the darkness, the confined space, the strange sounds that bounced off the stone walls, would have produced experiences that are very difficult to describe in ordinary language. Experiences that the people who underwent them would have understood as contact with something beyond ordinary reality. Whether you interpret that as literally true or as a product of altered brain chemistry, the intention of the builders is clear. They were not just building walls and passages. They were building a technology for transforming human consciousness. And the underground was the medium in which that technology operated. This idea that underground spaces were used as tools for altering perception and producing specific kinds of experience is not unique to Chavín. We find it in other parts of the Americas, and we find echoes of it in the ancient world of Europe and Asia as well. The oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece operated from a cleft in the earth, and ancient sources describe vapors rising from below that may have had psychoactive properties. The mystery cults of the ancient Mediterranean, which initiated their members through experiences of death and rebirth, often incorporated underground spaces into their rituals. The kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber used by the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, is a direct expression of this tradition, a deliberately created underground space for spiritual practice, for connection to the earth, for contact with the forces that live below the surface of the ordinary world. The underground in all these traditions was not a place you went by accident. It was a place you were taken, carefully and deliberately, when you were ready for something that the surface world could not provide. Now let us move north within the Americas. Let us travel from the high Andes to the lowland jungles of Central America, where another civilization left its mark underground in ways that are still being understood. The Maya were one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. Their understanding of astronomy was extraordinary. Their calendar systems were precise. Their mathematics included the concept of zero, independently developed, centuries before it appeared in Europe. And their relationship with the underground was profound, complex, and built into the very foundations of their worldview. In Maya cosmology, the underground was not a place of death or punishment in the way that some other traditions understood it. It was something more nuanced. The underground was Xibalba. The word is usually translated as place of fear, but that translation loses some of the richness of the original concept. Xibalba was the underworld, yes, but it was also the place from which life emerged. It was the womb of the earth, the place from which maize, the sacred food, grew upward into the world of the living. It was simultaneously a place of ending and a place of beginning. The Maya built their relationship with Xibalba into their physical world in very concrete ways. Cenotes, the natural sinkholes that punctuate the limestone landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula, were considered portals to Xibalba. These circular holes in the ground, filled with deep, clear water, were places where the boundary between the living world and the underground world was thin. They were sacred. They were used for ritual offerings, and in some cases, they were used for something more. Archaeological investigations of cenotes throughout the Yucatan have found extraordinary things at the bottom of these water-filled sinkholes. Jade objects, gold, carved stone, human remains, all of it deposited carefully and deliberately as offerings to the lords of Xibalba, as communication sent downward into the water, into the earth, into the other world that waited below. But the cenotes are natural. They were not built by human hands. The underground structures that the Maya did build, the ones that reveal their engineering as well as their cosmology, are in some ways even more interesting. Beneath many of the great Maya cities, there are cave systems. Some of these are entirely natural, formed by the same geological processes that created the cenotes above them. But others show clear evidence of human modification. Walls built within the caves, floors leveled, passages opened or widened. In some cases, entire cave chambers transformed into ritual spaces, with altars and offerings and the marks of long human use. The caves beneath the Maya city of Palenque, for example, have been partially explored and show evidence of both natural formation and human activity. The famous Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque contains a staircase that descends from the temple platform all the way down through the pyramid to a burial chamber at the base, the tomb of the ruler Pakal, who died in the 7th century of the Common Era. This tomb is not just a burial chamber. It is a carefully designed underground space, its walls covered in carvings depicting the ruler's journey through the underworld and his eventual emergence as a divine being. The architecture of his death was the architecture of the underground. His tomb was Xibalba, made real in stone. And beneath Palenque itself, beneath the surface of the city, there is a river, a real underground river, channeled and managed by Maya engineers, flowing through constructed tunnels beneath the city's main plaza. The Maya builders diverted this river underground, covering it with stone channels and vaulted tunnels, in order to manage the water and create a stable foundation for their city above. And in doing so, they placed the living world of their city directly above a controlled underground water flow, a real underground river that moved through the earth beneath their feet as they walked, prayed, and governed. The underground river beneath Palenque was not hidden because the Maya were ashamed of it or trying to conceal it. It was integrated into the design of the city. It was part of the cosmological statement that the city made. Above, the world of humans and gods, the temples and palaces and plazas where life was lived in the light. Below, the river and the dark and the world of Xibalba. And in between, the buildings and tunnels and managed channels that connected the two. This layered understanding of the world, with the underground as a real and significant layer of reality rather than just a space beneath the buildings, is something that runs through Maya civilization from its earliest periods to its latest. And it manifests physically, in stone and tunnel and managed water, in ways that are still being uncovered by archaeologists working in the jungle today. In fact, some of the most exciting archaeological discoveries of recent years have come from LiDAR surveys of the Maya lowlands. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is a technology that uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to map the surface of the ground beneath vegetation. When researchers used LiDAR over large areas of jungle in Guatemala and Belize and southern Mexico, they found, hidden beneath the forest canopy, the traces of Maya cities and infrastructure on a scale that completely changed our understanding of how large and complex Maya civilization was. And some of what they found was underground, tunnels connecting sites, underground spaces associated with large ceremonial centers, infrastructure, both above and below ground, that suggested a civilization managing its landscape and its water and its sacred geography with a sophistication that archaeology had not previously credited to it. The Maya underground is still being discovered. Right now, as we speak, as you lie quietly and let these words wash over you, there are researchers working in the jungle, carefully excavating, carefully mapping, carefully trying to understand what the Maya built beneath their world and why. The story is not finished. It is still unfolding. And every year the picture becomes a little richer, a little more complex, a little more astonishing. Let us now move to a part of the Americas that is less often discussed in the context of underground mysteries, but that deserves our attention. We are going to the American Southwest, to the high desert landscape of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. And we are going to look at the people who built their world both above and below the surface of this extraordinary landscape. The ancestral Pueblones, who were once called the Anasazi, though that name is now considered less appropriate, were the builders of some of the most remarkable architecture in pre-Columbian North America. Their cliff dwellings, built into the faces of canyon walls, are among the most photographed ancient structures on the continent. The great houses of Chaco Canyon, built with a precision and on a scale that still impresses modern architects, were the centers of a network that stretched across hundreds of miles of desert landscape. And at the heart of their architecture, literally at the center of their communities, was the kiva. The kiva is an underground ceremonial chamber, circular in most cases, though rectangular kivas exist as well, entered from above through a hole in the roof by descending a ladder. Built partly or entirely below the surface of the ground, and used for the most important communal and spiritual activities of Puebloan life. The kiva is not a tomb or a hiding place or a water system. It is something more purely symbolic than any of these. It is a representation of the world, The circular floor represents the earth. The walls represent the four directions. The ceiling represents the sky. And in the floor of every kiva there is a small hole. A hole that goes down into the earth beneath the kiva floor. This hole is called the sipapu, and in Puebloan cosmology, it represents the place through which the ancestors emerged from the underworld into this world. It is the navel of the world, the connection point between the underground and the living. The kiva, then, is an underground space that is itself a model of the universe. You descend into it, which is to say you go underground, and you find yourself inside a representation of the entire world. Above, the sky. Below, the earth. And in the floor, the sipapu, the hole within the hole, the underground within the underground, the connection to wherever the deepest things come from. This is one of the most elegant expressions of the human relationship with the underground that exists anywhere. It does not try to use the underground for practical purposes. It uses it for something that might be called cosmological. It uses the fact of being underground to make a statement about the nature of reality. To say, in architecture, what words can only gesture toward. Going underground in the Puebloan tradition is going home, going to the place from which the ancestors came, going to the origin point. And everything that happens in the kiva, every ceremony and council and moment of collective life, happens in that underground space because that is where the most important things belong. Not on the surface, under the open sky where everyone can see, but below in the contained dark, in the space that connects the present to the deep past and the deep origin. There are great kivas at Chaco Canyon that could hold hundreds of people. These were not intimate spaces. They were communal ones. Spaces where the community as a whole gathered underground to do the things that mattered most. And around and beneath these great kivas, there are tunnels, passages connecting the kivas to each other and to the great houses above, moving people and perhaps objects through the underground in ways that are not fully mapped or understood. The underground network at Chaco Canyon is one of the subjects of ongoing archaeological research, and it keeps revealing new complexities, new passages, new chambers, new evidence of a society that understood the underground not as a supplement to life on the surface, but as an essential dimension of life itself. And now, before we leave the Americas, there is one more place we need to visit, one more tunnel system that belongs to this story in a way that is impossible to ignore. We are going deep into the Amazon basin, into the heart of the South American rainforest, to a place where modern archaeology is only beginning to understand what was built here, and how, and by how many people. For most of the 20th century, the conventional understanding of the Amazon basin was that it was essentially wilderness, that the forest was too dense, the soil too poor, the conditions too difficult for large settled civilizations to develop there. The people of the Amazon were assumed to have lived in small, mobile groups, moving through the forest without leaving permanent marks. This understanding has been overturned, completely, decisively, and in ways that are still being absorbed by the wider world. The Amazon was not wilderness. It was a garden, a managed landscape maintained by millions of people over thousands of years, shaped and cultivated on a scale that is only now becoming visible through LiDAR surveys and systematic excavation. There were cities in the Amazon, large ones, connected by roads and causeways. With complex water management systems and agricultural technologies and social structures that supported populations of hundreds of thousands. And beneath the surface of the Amazon basin, there are tunnels. These tunnels were not made by human hands, but they were used by human hands, and they connect to the story of ancient underground spaces in a way that is genuinely astonishing. The tunnels of the Amazon are called paleoburrows. They were carved by giant ground sloths, enormous animals that went extinct at the end of the last ice age, 10 to 12,000 years ago. These creatures, some of them the size of elephants, used their massive claws to dig through the earth and rock, creating tunnels that in some cases are hundreds of meters long and large enough for a person to walk through upright. When geologists first discovered these tunnels in the early 21st century, they were initially uncertain what had made them. The scale was wrong for any known modern animal. The claw marks on the walls were enormous, and the sheer volume of material that had been removed from these tunnels, in some cases hundreds of cubic meters of earth and rock, suggested a creature of extraordinary size and strength. The identification of paleoburrows as the work of giant ground sloths and their relatives was a remarkable scientific discovery on its own terms. But what followed was even more interesting. Because when researchers began mapping the paleoburrows and studying their distribution, they found something unexpected. Many of them showed evidence of human use. Not recent human use, but ancient. Stone tools near the entrances, fire residue on the walls, evidence of occupation. The ancient peoples of the Amazon had found these enormous tunnels, made by creatures that had been extinct for thousands of years by the time the tunnels were discovered, and they had used them. They had gone into these spaces and made them their own. They had lived in them, sheltered in them, perhaps held ceremonies in them. And this raises a question that is both simple and profound. When ancient peoples in the Amazon entered a tunnel that had been carved by a creature that had been extinct for millennia, what did they think had made it? What story did they tell about the origin of the tunnel? What cosmological meaning did they attach to a passage that went deep into the earth and had been made by something so much larger and stronger than any creature living? We do not know the answer to that question. The cultures that used these tunnels did not leave written records that explain their thinking, but we can guess that the tunnels were not understood as simply convenient geological features. They were understood as something more, as gifts from the earth, as passages made by powerful ancient beings, as connections to a time and a world that preceded the current one. The underground, once again, as a place of origin, as a place where the deep past lives on in physical form, as a space that connects the present to something older and larger than itself.